You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. How can a simple shift in where you look bypass the thinking brain to reach trauma that language can't even describe? Stay tuned for today's episode. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer. What if everything we've been told about holistic health, healing, and well-being is only part of the story? Because thriving in today's world looks different than it used to. Here, we challenge the narratives, rethink what it means to become human, and explore how that shapes the way we lead, live, and step into our full potential. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. What if the direction of your gaze could shift what you feel and open access to experiences that words alone cannot reach? A subtle change in eye position becomes a doorway into deep layers of the nervous system, pointing to healing processes that do not rely on analysis or explanation. Dr. David Grand is the founder and developer of the international therapy modality Brainspotting. He is an internationally acclaimed lecturer, author, humanitarian, documentarian, and playwright. Dr. Grand has also applied brainspotting to performance and creativity enhancement. Let's meet Dr. David Grand. Hi, Dr. Grand. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because I'm seeing Brainspotting everywhere online, and I've been so curious to speak with you about it and find out more about it. And I'm sure our listeners are really curious too. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's my absolute pleasure. And could you start us off with maybe a little bit about yourself and the parts of your story or your journey that you feel connect to what you do today, and maybe share with our listeners a little bit about what you do today as well? I know we'll get into more of that a bit later.
I was born in New York, and I've lived in New York. Now I live in Long Island, which is the suburbs, my entire life. But I've traveled since I was very young. My family traveled around the country, United States, around the world. So when I was 7, my parents took myself and my sister off from school for May and June, and we traveled around Europe and the Middle East and countless countries and so on. This was many decades ago, and Europe and the Middle East was very different than it is now. But what it did is it opened my eyes to culture. And it was such a culturally immersive experience. And my parents made culture and diversity something to really be excited about, the opposite of xenophobia. And so when I don't say I discovered Brainspotting, I say I noticed it, because observing how relevant the eyes are to access ourselves, our bodies, our nervous systems, I didn't discover it. It was out there, so I noticed it. But after I noticed Brainspotting, started to develop it, and when I set up to do the first 5 trainings ever in Brainspotting, that was in 2004 to 2005, I did 3 in the United States, but I did 2 outside of the United States, 1 in Buenos Aires and 1 in Berlin. And what I did is, from the beginning, I established Brainspotting as an international phenomenon. That goes all the way back to when I was 7, and I had that international exposure. Most people from the United States wouldn't have had that sensibility, but I did. And the result is that we have Brainspotting communities in every continent. And Brainspotting is not only strong in the United States and North America, but in South America, in Europe, in Asia. We're growing in Africa. So it all organically comes from the same source.
Thank you for sharing that. I love this culture piece that you're touching on. And I feel I'm an immigrant myself in several countries now. I definitely hear you on expanding your horizons, and travel as a way to do that. And especially when you do it as a family, I feel it just builds different kind of connections and challenges you in different kind of ways. So yeah, what an amazing childhood for that. And let us know a little bit about what brain spotting is in that sense. I'm not sure all of our listeners are familiar with it yet. We want to change that in this episode. So let us know a bit about what brain spotting actually is.
I'm going to come at it a bit differently than I usually do. I know your show is really about things that are holistic, and I'm going to look at it from a holistic point of view. The watchword in brain spotting is where you look affects how you feel. In literal terms, that means if you're thinking about something that's bothering you and you look off to your left, it'll feel one way. But if you shift and you look off to your right, it feels different. Now, there can be a quantitative difference. It can feel more intense or less intense, or it can be a qualitative difference. It can just feel one side can feel a little more anxious. The other side can feel a little bit more vulnerable. So where you look affects how you feel. And what that means in the context of brain spotting is that the eyes are an absolutely unique part of the body, and they're an absolutely unique way of accessing deep into the body, deep into the nervous system. There are many body-based therapies or somatic therapies that have been around now for some decades that are very effective, and when they came about were true advances in the field, but they never really looked at what is the most unique part of the body in terms of how we perceive our environment on the outside, but also how we access our environment on the inside, which is the eyes. And I'm always curious about why something that is so obvious is so overlooked by so many brilliant people. Just a little bit more about the eyes. The retina and the optic nerve that are central to receiving and converting and transmitting the visual image that comes into the eyes are made up entirely of neurons, of brain cells. And the retina and the optic nerve are neuronal pathways. And they're part of the second cranial nerve. That's getting a little bit real brain technical and so on. But we have 12 cranial nerves. The 10th cranial nerve is the only one that's famous because it's the vagus nerve. It's part of polyvagal theory, which has gotten a lot of attention and for all the right reasons. But this second cranial nerve is, I'm not going to say it's just as important, but they're all important in their own way. But it is part of our visual system. So what happens is the eyes not only see the information, the eyes process the information. They see and process at the same time, because there's no other part of the body where that happens. And they transmit the information. Okay. One last thing on this. Every eye has 6 eye muscles that hold it in place and move it. They're called the extraocular muscles. And those extraocular muscles are loaded with reflexes. Okay. And they're loaded with cranial nerves and so on. What I discovered through brain spotting was that you can literally access unprocessed trauma deep in the nervous system, which is held not in one place, it's held in configurations, but you can access this unprocessed trauma through eye positions. And when you find the right eye position and you have the person just look right at that eye position, they go into deep processing. And it's really an aspect of mindfulness. And in this context, things can happen that, again, going back to the holistic, the body knows how to heal itself and the nervous system knows how to heal itself. But this unprocessed trauma blocks that healing process and it's lost and the nervous system can't find it, can't figure it out. But through the eye positions, the nervous system is able to do what it knows how to do, which is to find it, process it, release it, and to go on.
Wow. As you're explaining this, I'm going along moving my eyes to the left and the right while I was listening to you. And it is fascinating how my feeling changed as I was doing that. So listeners, definitely give this a try and see what happens when you do that. I think I made the fascinating discovery that I hardly ever look to the right. I mainly always look to the left. Yeah, fascinating how you came across this, how you became sensitive to this even as a younger child. How did you connect this to your travels and discovering new things? How did you connect the fact that when we're looking at different things in different eye positions, that would help resolve trauma? How did that come about? I'm so curious.
I'll just say that, again, my family, we did a lot of traveling. And I was very observant, very curious, and very creative as a young child. And I noticed, this is like maybe a little boy kind of thing, but that when we went to Los Angeles, that the buses were different than the buses in New York. The cars were the same, but the buses were different. I even noticed that the stoplights were different. And when I noticed it, and I was curious about it, my question is always like, why is this? How is this? Where does this come from? So the same person who was sitting across from this client who happened to be an ice skater, who noticed as we were slowly tracking her eyes, and noticed that her eyes went into this intense wobble. And I stopped over there. Was the same, came from the same little boy who noticed, how things look different in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world, and was curious and even fascinated about it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think those cultural experiences will definitely make you tune in a little bit more to that. So
let me just say, we were in Holland during tulip season, and we were in a car going past the tulip fields that were as far as your eye could see on all directions. I don't think Holland is known for its tulips. I don't think there was any other place that has these kind of tulips. But as far as you could see, and the gentle wind would be going, and they'd all be waving like this, just absolute sensory overload of the greatest kind.
yeah, and the colors too. They're all different colors.
Yeah.
Yeah, the eyes have lots to process there for sure. And how did you come to understand? I think if we're talking about brain spotting in a sense that we're moving to different eye positions, did you understand this as these are the same eye positions for all people? Or did you come to the conclusion that each person is a little bit different and there may be different eye positions for them? Or how does that connect to brain spotting?
Put the word absolutely before the word different when it comes to this. Okay. The visual system is so complex, so unique, and it's always evolving. So that it's not just, it's different from person to person. It's different in each person from situation to situation and from one time to another. So there's no fixed map. It's not you look up here for this and you look over here for that. And excuse me, some models have postulated that. What I found is that it's always different. And that's what makes it so unique in terms of accessing the nervous system. And what happened with this ice skater is she was blocked on one jump, which was a triple loop. Okay. And we had done a lot of trauma work before around her sport and also in her family. And when I found that spot, when her eye just wobbled and I stopped over there, for 10 minutes, she went into the most intense processing. And she was literally watching videos of these traumas on my fingers. And she was illustrating it as it was happening. A trauma would come up that processed through. Another trauma comes, okay, it's going away. It's okay now. And these were traumas that we hadn't gotten to in the year of therapy, which was trauma informed. After 5 minutes, traumas that we had worked on that we thought, that we had resolved, resurfaced, reopened, and processed through to a deeper level. It showed me, as effective as the work was, there was more to do that I didn't even know. After 10 minutes, her eye relaxed and we went on. She was blocked on this jump to triple loop where she would only turn 2 times instead of 3 times. And she called me the next morning from the skating rink and she said, David, I just did a triple loop with no problem. And I did it again and again, and she never had a problem with it again. And from there, I started to observe reflexes and anomalies in the eyes and face as we tracked across. Like you go across and all of a sudden a person's eyes just start blinking like this, or you go here and the person's eyes do a hard blink. You go here and a person like leans forward and squints. Go here and the head recoils. They're all clues that there's something there in that visual field right there when a person is activated and working on something that's bothering them. But remember, once you find it, that's not the end of the journey. That's the beginning, because you keep it in place and the person maintains the eye gaze there and they follow it wherever it goes. And it always goes someplace meaningful, and it always goes someplace that's unpredictable.
I'm getting the sense as you're explaining this that through our eyes, we can somehow reach a part inside of us that we can't access with just talk therapy or some other modalities, a different kind of place that we need to access exactly in a certain way that you were demonstrating by moving your fingers to actually access these layers where the trauma and these blocks are stored. So this, I'm getting the sense, is not a logical thing or something we can think our way in or out of, but a real kind of unlocking of something inside. Is this connected to the nerves that we are working with, or how are you looking at what actually happens when you do brain spotting?
First of all, the neocortex, the human thinking brain that's right on top, okay, which makes us who we are and is phenomenal, has no capacity to regulate the nervous system. Zero. This is where language is. This is where thought is. Okay. Below the neocortex, we call the subcortex. That's where emotion, intuition, and the body experience is, body processes. Okay. That's where regulation happens. So if you're involved in a talk therapy or a thought-based therapy, it's all over here, but you don't get past it. You don't get down. We look to bypass the neocortex and to get to the subcortex. But we also we don't just look at the brain, we look at the entire nervous system. Because remember, we have neural pathways that go throughout the entire body and that go to and are in the heart, and it goes into the digestive system, and it goes into every organ, all the connective tissue and so on. It goes from the tops of our heads to the bottom of our toes and to our fingertips. And it's all made up of neurons, brain cells, what we call brain cells, that have no capacity for thought or language, but totally are able to know how to get us alive and keep us alive.
Wow. I've never had it explained like that. That actually makes so much sense now, why a lot of people get stuck in some of these therapies and wonder why they're not moving forward. But that makes actually so much sense. And you touched on something really curious when you were just explaining one of the sessions, that it actually worked very quickly. This block came undone in a fairly, I want to say, short amount of time, having spent a decade in therapy myself. That sounds like a very short time to resolve some of these blocks. So how is it that brain spotting can be so effective, I want to say, in a fairly short amount of time?
I don't want to give a misimpression that whatever ails us emotionally, whatever traumas we carry, especially from childhood, you can come in 1 or 2 or a few sessions and get a full resolution of that, because the nervous system is just too complicated for that. But what might take 5 years in one therapy might take 5 months in brain spotting. For instance, what might take a year in another therapy might take 8 sessions in brain spotting. Speed is a relative thing when it comes to this. There's one more thing I want to mention, which is central to brain spotting, and it's called the uncertainty principle. And it really goes to contrast brain spotting to most, if not all, therapies. The human nervous system has 1 to 4 quadrillion synaptic connections. What is a quadrillion? If you take 1 billion and you multiply it by 1 million, you get a quadrillion. Okay. And we might have up to 4 quadrillion synaptic connections. Okay. That is more than the known stars in the universe. Inside of our bodies and our nervous systems, there's more synaptic connections than stars in the universe, it's an impossibility except for the fact that it's true. Okay. What this means is when a therapist sits down in front of a client who comes to see them, that therapist can't know what's going on inside of that client. It is neurophysiologically impossible. Okay, but most therapists are taught theory and practice, and you are the expert. The client needs your expertise, and which puts the therapist in an elevated position, a power position, and so on. That's not really conducive to healing. Okay, the therapists are taught to take a history, to form a diagnosis, and the diagnosis always ends with the word disorder. And then from there to set a treatment plan with treatment goals that leads to the interventions. The uncertainty principle of Brainspotting says that is an impossibility. All of that assumes or presupposes that the therapist can know that which they cannot know. And it shows that most therapists are working from a certainty model as opposed from an uncertainty model. In Brainspotting, what we teach our therapists right from the first training on is the uncertainty principle, which is don't try to know what you can't know. And that creates a crisis of confidence for therapists who've invested years and decades into different models and into using them and have been successful with the models too. It's not because they're using these models, it just doesn't work. They work relatively. So then the therapist will say, if all we have is uncertainty, where does that leave us? And we say in Brainspotting, in the face of uncertainty, all you have is the frame. The frame is what the client brings. It's the issues that drive them to come for the first session and each subsequent session. And the frame is what the therapist mindfully receives from the client in that first session and each following session, and then holds that frame with the client and then shapes it with them to optimize the healing that comes out of the processing inside of it. And the frame, not only does the frame help the processing to move dynamically, the processing also shapes the frame, with its own dynamism. So again, in the face of uncertainty, all we have is the frame, and that's central to Brainspotting. And the frame is based on the relationship, and it's based on the eye positions and the neurobiology, which simplifies things.
Yeah, it certainly is a change in perspective, I think, of maybe how we sometimes look at therapy. And as you said, the roles within therapy. So I like this new perspective and rethinking this a little bit. And would you say then that the client and the practitioners on this journey of discovery together, as they are both finding out what comes up for the client, as the practitioner can't know this in advance? So are they discovering this together, peeling back the layers and working on that?
Yes, but the client always leads the way. We have a metaphor in Brainspotting that the client is the head of the comet and the therapist tries to get into the tail of the comet. And as such, the therapist is always following the client wherever they go. So it's really the client's journey of discovery that the therapist is trying to follow because it happens so rapidly and so incredibly. And so in essence, it's the client's journey that is facilitated by the therapist and followed by the therapist, but never controlled by the therapist in any way.
It sounds like a very empowering space for a client to come into in that sense. So yeah, I like the sound of that. And I'm wondering, this is more of along the lines of what we're actually processing in the Brainspotting therapy. How does the client connect to these pieces that might come up, these experiences, these traumas that might come up? Because I know a lot of the times, as was my own experience, felt a bit re-traumatized by talking about things over, and then they were coming up and we talk about it again. And how does that work with Brainspotting when people are finding these traumas that are coming up? Does it just process, or they have some emotional reactions? How do you put that into a container where the client is safe to do those things?
The container is the relationship. And the container is also the relationship where the therapist is attuned and present and empathic and respectful of the client, which is more powerful than anything else. And it's the most salient aspect of every psychotherapy process, that relationship. But the processing is so deep and so rapid that the client could never even illustrate everything that's happening. Not that they have to. Some clients will go into this deep processing. They're on the spot and they just drop down. And unless you check in with them, they won't even say anything because they're so deep in their process. But even if they never tell you one word about where they went, it really doesn't make a difference because it happens. It's potentiated inside of the client. So it's a relational therapy, but it's not necessarily a talk therapy. There's some clients who, interestingly, as they're looking at that spot, will illustrate the processing as it's happening. And for them, it actually facilitates it, in contrast to the clients who need to not talk. I've had clients who were on that spot for 15 minutes, and I went to step in to ask, just to check out where they were at, and they went like this, which meant, don't interrupt me. Okay. And I just said, let me know when you're ready to tell me anything. And who knows how long they went after that. So again, it's very individual. The cure is not in the talking. The cure is processing inside of that mutually held frame. And it goes wherever it goes. And because it's in the subcortex below the neocortex, there's no language and there's no thought down there. So any attempts to even describe what's going on are going to be very limited and limited in their effectiveness. We use a rating scale, a simple rating scale of 0 to 10 of how much you're feeling, whatever you're feeling. 10 is the highest, 0 is none. So it's like a thermometer that sometimes helps us to see whether they're coming through things and de-escalating neurologically, or whether sometimes it's opening up or it spikes up.
Yeah. Again, that makes so much sense as you're describing that with the different parts of the brain where there's no language. Sometimes it happens when we go through a lot of chronic stress or trauma. We don't have language for that. Yeah, it's very fascinating that we can process that through brain spotting. I have a couple of practical questions for you because I'm curious. Does this work for people who are visually impaired? Can they still do brain spotting when they may not see well or they may not see at all? How does that work? Does that still work at all?
Absolutely. The most profound example is people who are blind from birth. Now you could say, how could you find eye positions with them? If one has a reductionistic attitude that is always looking for why you can't do something, well, that's as far as you're going to go. I've seen this in movies where someone who's blind feels somebody's face and they say, oh, you have a kind face, or you have a beautiful face, and so on. And it's not just in movies. How does that happen? How can they tell? By using their sense of touch, the information is going into what's called the occipital cortex, which is in the back of the brain. That's where the visual images are formed. Okay. We don't see in our eyes, we see deep in our brain. Okay. It just seems like we're seeing in our eyes. So instead of the information coming in a visual stream into the eyes, it comes in a tactile stream this way. Remember, people who can't see still are orienting in their spatial environment. So there's a sense of something is more to my right or something is more to my left. And there is a visual component to it, even if they can't see. Their brain is creating the imagery. I'll say to a person, and I've worked with some people who are blind, some blind from birth, that say, I want you to turn your head to your right, see how much you feel it over there. Now straight ahead, how you feel it there. And now over to your left. It's over there. Literally a point right there. The larger point here is that it is for the therapist and the therapy to adapt to the client, not for the client to adapt to the therapist or the therapy.
That's well said. Actually, food for thought right there. Yeah. That's so curious. And I'm glad to hear that still works. So obviously we have many different ways of receiving input. So the body adapts as well. The mind adapts and we work with that. Wow. Yeah. It's
Now, I'll just
fascinating.
give another example. There is this misconception that you can't, for among therapists, that you can't work with somebody if they're not in touch with their emotions, or they're not in touch with their body, or if they're cut off from themselves, whatever that means. To me, it's a bias. And brain spotting proves that's absolutely untrue. Give you an example. If a client comes in for therapy, it takes a lot to see a therapist, and they come in and then the therapist says, okay, what would you like to work on? And they say whatever it is. And they say, are you feeling it now? Are you activated? No. Okay. And whatever pushing and prodding, they can't come up with the client feeling anything like that. And they say, then I can't work with you. Brainspotting will never say that. Brainspotting said, let's figure out how we can work together. But there's a cue, and this goes for every therapist and every therapy and every session. The client, when they started talking, about what they came for that first session or follow-up sessions, their eyes immediately flicked and went to an eye position. And they started talking while they're looking in that direction, sometimes even like they're talking over there. Okay. They revealed a relevant eye position, which we call a gaze spot because it comes from natural gaze. Okay. And all you have to do is say, just keep looking where you're looking and notice what comes up and so on. And even if they say nothing's happening, we know that's an impossibility. The superhighways are very active for all people, even people who have difficulty being aware of their bodies or their internal process. So just give yourself all the time, space and time and so on. Person's looking there and say, just unimportant things are coming out. And say, that's all brain process. Okay. Say, just follow it, be curious about it. It might take 5, 10, 15 minutes. All of a sudden, the person started saying, I had a memory come up. Now, remember, this was with someone who couldn't articulate anything feeling emotionally or in their body, who were seen as being cut off and not amenable to therapy, non-responders. Absurd. It's absolutely absurd. I had a client who I did a session with, the first session with, and they showed absolutely no emotion the entire way through, followed all the instructions, did everything like that. And this was someone who had been in a lot of therapy and was on the more mature side. And at the end of the session, that person who showed no emotion said, that was the most profound experience I've ever had. But for someone who, again, was coming from a certainty model, someone whose horizons had been narrowed, they wouldn't be open to all the possibilities that people respond differently, and everybody responds differently.
Yeah, I like the way that this is unique to each person, as we are all different. And as you said, not all the same eye positions. We don't all have the same trauma or stress. So yeah, this individual work is absolutely fantastic to hear. That is the foundation of Brainspotting when you want to work with that. Now, for our international listeners, does this work online? Can you do virtual sessions with Brainspotting, or is this something that has to be done in person?
Before COVID, I would have never considered working virtually. So again, what that meant is I had an office in Manhattan and one out here on Long Island. So you'd have to be able and willing to travel, usually from the local area and so on. When COVID hit, okay, and I remember that last day I was leaving my office, I knew I wasn't going to be there for a while. I locked up and so on. The only way that I could continue doing the work with my clients and they could continue getting therapy with me, Brainspotting, was virtually. So overnight, I had to turn my practice over into virtual therapy, which I never wanted to do. I never thought I was going to do, didn't think it would work. And I found out not only did it work better than I could have imagined, it seemed to work almost as well. And sometimes there were even benefits because people, they didn't have to come to the office. They didn't have to go through traffic, sit in the waiting room. And then after the session, they didn't have to go through everything they had to do to get home or wherever they were going. Most clients do the virtual sessions from home. And at the end, you just start. And then when you're finished, you're there and you're in a safe, comfortable place. But it also expanded the possibility for me to work with people who could never geographically make it to my office. And honestly, my practice, I turned it into a virtual practice. And to this day, I still see all of my clients virtually. So going to international folks who are listening or watching, this breaks down the borders. And not only do we, not that people don't do in-person brain spotting, because people do, but I'd say more people do it virtually than in person. Even our trainings that I never would have considered doing a virtual training of brain spotting, it was either go virtual or go away. So we went virtual, and I do most of my trainings virtually. And when I do a training now in Asia, instead of having to travel there, I do it from my home office. And the time can be a little crazy, but I don't have to do that travel per se.
Yeah, I do feel that the access that became available through COVID is one of the things that changed, I think, for a lot of practitioners and therapists. how people finally were gaining access to things that may have never been available to them before because there were maybe no practitioners where they lived or even in the country they lived in, and it wasn't practical for them to travel anywhere. So yeah, that is, I think, one of the things that happened and changed the landscape of that a little bit that I am personally very grateful for is I now have access to things like Brainspotting because there's no practitioner here yet. Maybe we'll change that. But yeah, that access that was generated, which I think for people looking for their own healing journeys, looking to experience that healing and try these modalities, that's certainly a benefit internationally that they can do that now. So wonderful to hear that.
And we have big communities just in Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Thailand and mainland China and Taiwan and Australia and New Zealand. And I'm just talking Asia, and I'm leaving out Indonesia. We have a great community in Indonesia. India, Brainspotting is starting to spread now. So you can, even if it's virtual, you can see someone who works in your language and your culture and your time zone.
Yeah, absolutely. Ah, that's exciting to hear. And do you want to share maybe with our listeners how they can connect with you, how they can reach you, and what kind of programs and services you have available? So if they'd like to know more about Brainspotting, or if they might want to try it, what's the best way to get that started?
The website is very comprehensive. We have a lot of information on this. And there's a lot of references to video information that's out there on YouTube and other sources and so on. So it's the brainspotting.com website is Nerve Central. There is a communication thing where you can send an email that will get to my assistant, and she helps me to get through them and so on. But that information is available. And if you just go online, you'll find a wealth of information in addition to my website. Interestingly enough, with AI, if you go on ChatGPT or whatever AI you do, and you ask about Brainspotting, you'll get a wealth of information. I have a book out that came out 10 years ago. My new Brainspotting book is coming out in a year and so on. And the original book was translated into 10 languages. And my new book is going to be quickly translated into, again, Spanish and Portuguese and German, French, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, etc., etc.
Wonderful resources. And of course, we will be linking to all of David's offerings in the show notes as well. So be sure to check there how you can find the website. And we'll link to your book as well. And we look forward to another book coming. I feel that's really great timing with everything becoming more international, more virtual, and people also have access to books. So that sounds wonderful. Can't wait. And I just want to thank you for being here today and joining me on the show and taking the time to share this amazing journey that you've been on since you were a child to bring Brainspotting to your practitioners and also to clients to experience that for themselves. I'm truly grateful that you shared my space today. Thank you so much for being here, David.
It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here, Petra.
Thank you so much. And yeah, pleasure is all mine. And thanks everyone for tuning in today and for spending this time with us. I hope you're taking away some of the nuggets and maybe finding that Brainspotting is something you want to look into more and explore further on your own healing journey. And I'd love to hear about that. So if you have comments on that or you want to share your experiences, reach out to us on the socials, reach out to us on the podcast here. And I'd love to hear more about your own Brainspotting experience. Thank you, David, for being here today. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and take care and be well. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejorni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.